Good morning, everyone. My name is Maia Miguel, Senior Executive Director for Foundation Relations and Executive Director for FIU Foundation's Office of Inclusive Philanthropy. In honor of Native American Heritage Month, we are pleased to present today's roundtable discussion, A Culture of Giving, Native American Philanthropy. As cited on the Native Americans in Philanthropy website, Native American societies are sophisticated in social and economic structures, including kin relationships, child rearing practices, continental trade, and philanthropy. Centuries of colonialism and genocide disrupted our traditions and communities, and intergenerational trauma and modern day colonial practices still threaten the wellness and survival of Native youth and future generations. Our guest today will share with us a bit about tribal history, philanthropic giving, and engaging Native Americans, Indigenous individuals. Before we introduce our guest, I would like to ask Mandy, Team Lead for Indigenous Initiatives, to read our land acknowledgement. Mandy?
Thank you, Maia. So in 2020, FIU's Global Indigenous Forum produced a land acknowledgement to recognize and pay our respects to the traditional custodians of this land on which we occupy, and to the elders past and present. Together with our Council of Elders, the Board of Directors at the Global Indigenous Forum carefully crafted this living, breathing statement. Florida International University acknowledges that our institution is located on the ancestral homelands of sovereign Native nations, including the Tequesta, the Calusa, and today the Seminole Tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida. We pay our respects to the traditional custodians, the elders past and present, by fully recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, as well as the historical and contemporary relationship between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. It is within our responsibility as an academic institution to uphold knowledge about the history of FIU with the original stewards of this land that we live, learn, and work on. We encourage our university community to read and learn about ways to support our local Indigenous communities in their efforts to preserve Seminole and Miccosukee land rights, cultural practices, and aid them in the conservation of our environment. Consistent with our university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, FIU is working towards creating an academic environment that is inclusive of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff who have been rendered invisible due to structural discriminatory practices. At FIU, we hold ourselves accountable to serving local, regional, and worldwide Indigenous communities through academic, policy-oriented research, education, partnerships, community service, as well as enrollment initiatives to overcome the effects of Indigenous exclusion and erasure in our own academic institution. It is our hope that acknowledging the land helps us to better understand that harm has been done and to address the legacies of violence in our communities in order to create a pathway to true healing. And with that, I am pleased to introduce our guests for today. We have Brittany Schulman, who is the Director of Indigenous Knowledge and Power Building Networks at Native Americans in Philanthropy. We also have Dawn Knickerbocker, who is Vice President of Development and External Engagement at Native Americans in Philanthropy. And then we also welcome Talbert Cypress, who is currently a councilman for the Miccosukee Tribe and is currently running for chairman. Welcome, everybody. So Talbert, our first question is for you. So can you please share with us the history related to the Miccosukee Tribe's migration to Florida, as well as the history behind the group that traveled to Cuba to request international recognition as a sovereign country within the US?
Okay, gladly. My people of Miccosukee originated from the Teaching-speaking hunters who lived southward. They eventually moved down to Florida. They settled in Jefferson County near Tallahassee, near a lake called Miccosukee. And one band of Teaching speakers would eventually become known by that name, and that's us. Miccosukee became the name of our language. Although we call it Ilapungi, that's the name of our language to us. The Miccosukee were also recognized by that name as early as 1793 by Spain. We had a treaty with Spain. I believe it's the Treaty of Walnut Hills. But to American colonists at the time, every Indian in Florida was known as pretty much Seminole. So they were just all lump us together. After the Indian Removal Act, the Miccosukee were the ones that led the fight to remain in Florida. There was a Miccosukee leader named Sam Jones. He'd become to be known as Sam Jones be damned after fighting during the Second Seminole War. He would refuse to surrender, and he wouldn't ever be caught throughout his lifetime. Miccosukee would capture any chief that made peace with the U.S. and would sometimes execute them in order to send a message that we're not going to make peace with the U.S. So that's the warrior mentality that we had. And then the women also made a lot of sacrifices to remain in Florida. They would often hide children, teach them to be silent, teach them to be still. Sometimes children would have to be left because of the pursuit of the U.S. government. So there was a lot of sacrifice made by the women to preserve the tribe in Florida. Sam Jones would die at over 100 years old in Florida, never having been caught, just like he said he never would be. And our people are still here because of that. And also the U.S. government would continue to make no distinction between Miccosukee and Seminole. The remaining were about 300 people left down here. We were kind of mixed in with each other. Some would marry in with Seminole, some would, move southward. Most of the Seminoles would eventually settle on the reservations, and the Miccosukee would continue to live a more traditional lifestyle in the Everglades, in the hammocks. But after the construction of the Tamiami Trail, that kind of isolation became impossible at that time. So the Seminole tribe would officially be recognized in 1957, and the US would refuse to acknowledge land and sovereignty claims by the Miccosukee. The Miccosukee had land claims through Spain, France, and British treaties that we felt the United States adopted once they got possession of this land. Eventually, they didn't see it that way, obviously. Eventually, a delegation got together, and they were invited by Fidel Castro to Cuba to be officially recognized internationally as a sovereign nation. This government decided at that time they would pretty much tell the Miccosukee, don't speak to Cuba anymore, and we'll give you your recognition. And that's how we got our recognition in 1962. Right now, the Miccosukee Tribe is at about 600 people. We have about maybe 100 more that are not affiliated with any tribe. They choose not to affiliate with Miccosukee or the Seminole, but we recognize them as a Miccosukee. That's about it. Any questions?
Thank you, Talbert. Okay, so thanks again, Talbert. I appreciate learning more about the history. So I'm going to move over to Brittany and Dawn. Brittany, I'm going to ask one question, and then I'll have you and Dawn go into the presentation, if you don't mind. So Brittany, long before European colonization, Native American traditions of giving were rooted in cultural beliefs of mutual responsibility, the importance of maintaining a peaceful balance, and a spiritual interconnectedness to all things. Can you please explain the idea of reciprocal giving, or the circle of giving, in Native communities?
Tanake Harurira. My name's Brittany Schulman. I'm Wakamasuan, and very happy to be here to share a little bit more about our story as Native people. Understanding that our stories are very diverse, whether it's from our brother here, or from my tribe, or from Dom. So really understanding I think the level setting that we need to start with is the fact that Indigenous value systems is a completely different worldview from the Euro-American worldview. It really centers on relationships and understanding how deep those relationships go. So those relationships aren't just with people, they are also with the land. Indigenous peoples lived in relationship with the land, understanding that those relationships when you have a relationship with someone, that you have a responsibility to that person, to that place. And that is a big, deep part of that understanding. And those relationships are reciprocal. It isn't just a one way. It's actually very rooted in understanding that we all belong to each other, and we all have that responsibility, and that when we give, we also get, and when we get, we also give. So that's really the first level setting part of the conversation, is understanding when the first colonists, the first settlers were moving into our areas. In the beginning, sometimes there were massacres, and there were lots of stories of us teaching them how to live on our land, and how to work together, and how to be in relationship. And that extends not just in our philosophical beliefs, but also in our governance. When you talk about the formation of the United States, you cannot talk about the different confederacies, because there was the Haudenosaunee, which is the most famous, and there are so many documents of the founding brothers going up and studying and understanding how that worked, because there wasn't anything like that in Europe. There was not this place of, we can all come together, collectively make decisions, and we can also be autonomous, independent human beings as well. So that representative democracy really is an Indigenous idea that comes from the Americas. And the three branches of government, that was definitely the clan chiefs, the clan mothers, and war chiefs, and that they had distinct responsibilities in those relationships. So we were very sophisticated peoples. We didn't just live nomadically and very close to the land, in the sense that we were wearing loincloths. We had huge cities that rivaled those of Europe. We had major urban areas, and we had folks who were still nomadic. So when you again talk about the history of the United States, the fact that we were very sophisticated peoples with massive trade routes up and down Turtle Island into South America, understanding that you had the eagle and the condor coming together, that we knew that we had these trade routes. And in fact, you can overlay the US highway system, and those were our trade routes. Those were ways in which we traded with one another. So we were very sophisticated in our sharing, in our working together. And it wasn't uncommon for us to speak multiple languages, because I imagine Miccosukee is very different than Wakamasuan, which is very different from a Ojibwe that my sister speaks. So it's those different languages we would have spoken, not just our language, our neighbor's language, and also multiple trade languages. So there is our communities were very sophisticated, very much thriving, and continue to thrive in a lot of ways. So when we talk about the circle of giving, going back to that deep understanding of relationships and those reciprocal responsibilities, it is about values. It is about understanding that you have that responsibility and that it's important. There is also an honor in being able to give more. So again, the idea of wealth isn't this, let me have and let me hoard and let me be greedy. The idea of wealth is that if, and to quote my grandfather, if my neighbor has more than what he needs, I want him to have more than what he needs. Because if he has more than what he needs, then I don't have to help him because he's doing, he's living. And just a quick story from my community, we did not have mortgages until the 80s. First of all, my people were not allowed to go to banks and get mortgages. No one was going to lend to Native people in even the late 1900s. So what my people did was they would trade trades. My house that I grew up in, my grandfather built it. My uncle did the electrical work. My other uncle, the Native way, because that's a relationship, he did the plumbing. And we traded back and forth with each other to build homes for each other. So a lot of my community have beautiful, wonderful stick-built homes that we did ourselves because we had to. It wasn't because we were super rich. It was because our people needed places to stay. And I think in understanding how deep that goes and how, and even how we continue to do that, I think it really speaks to that circle of giving, that understanding that we're all interconnected. And if one of us is thriving, all of us is thriving. If one of us is hurting, all of us are hurting.
Thank you, Brittany. So this is another question for either Brittany or Dawn. So one of the purposes of Native American philanthropy is to retain cultural traditions, languages, and religious beliefs. Native philanthropy has saved your culture, and because of this, we are seeing an increase in non-Native foundations and the U.S. government regaining their interest in future funding opportunities. Can you speak to how entrepreneurial capital ventures have provided funding and economic advancement for Native American communities, and also the continued development of prominent Native American philanthropic institutions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mandy, for that question. I think both Brittany and I can speak on this a little bit. It's first really important to take a look at who Native people are. As Brittany talked about, we are very diverse from coast to coast along Turtle Island. Our median income, according to the latest US Census, is $37,000, which is half of the overall US figure. 25% have a college degree, which is much lower than other communities. But we have many, many strengths, and these are not considered weaknesses at all in our eyes. 54% of Native people speak more than one language. 22% live on or near a reservation. But make no mistake, this is all Indigenous land, so we are all on our homelands. We have an estimated buying power of $115 billion, which most of that buying power comes from tribally supported economic engines and then tribally owned enterprises. Probably a little known fact is that tribally owned enterprises are required to give to non-Native communities. And we do have a long history of giving from our Indigenous enterprises and communities. Great example is Choctaw Nation more than 170 years ago, who were themselves quite poor, had heard about the starving Irish families during the potato famine. They gathered funds and they sent much needed money during that time of crisis. And then we found during an analysis of COVID-19 responses where Native Americans moved more than $38 million in responsive pooled funds. Also, some of our tribal nations are very generous, including the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians that recently presented a $25 million gift to a children's hospital. Shakopee Minnewakan Sioux Tribe gave $15 million in donations to education, youth activities, healthcare programs, and so on. It's also really important to understand that we are unique in the mission of Native Americans in philanthropy. We're not saved, but our mission is to promote equitable and effective philanthropy in Native communities. We work closely with our counterpart organizations, including tribal nations, Native-led organizations, and even traditional philanthropy to support the sector. From Native-led organizations throughout the country. We're the only organization that nurtures and supports networks of diverse Native stakeholders in the philanthropic field. So it's important to also understand that we're rooted in our deep traditions and our distinct ways of life as people who have a dual citizenship and belonging. We are people, our tribal nations have our people, of course, they are the essence of our nations and belonging, whether they live on or off reservation land. Our land is also connected both physically and spiritually, and it helps define who we are as people. Our languages are based on our land. Our culture, our traditions, our new ways and our old ways, they sustain our societies, our families, our clans, our art, our ceremonies, and all of our life ways. And finally, our governance, our social organizing, our political structures, they vary from nation to nation based on our unique histories and our worldviews. And at Native Americans in Philanthropy, we leverage the power and the wisdom from our Native networks to increase authentic visibility of Native people and communities. We develop tools and resources to educate funders, and then we work to establish more meaningful relationships that align with our Indigenous worldviews. So hopefully that helps, Mandy.
It does. Thank you, Dawn. Can Dawn, you or Brittany talk a little bit more about, the community in terms of what that looks like from a philanthropic perspective, and more so the relationship in terms of the land. I even think of students and how can we help engage more in terms of our students at an academic institution that's encompassing the community and not just them, to make them feel more included.
Yeah, let me share my screen really quick. So for students and also for your faculty and staff, and Brittany, please feel free to jump in here. It's important to acknowledge that we are here. You will find Native people in every corner of your organization and your just the cities and communities where you live. We have strong cultural values, respect for others, and for spirit. We have strong societal values, strong work ethics, and we're very generous and social, as you may know. I think it's also important to understand how we give as Native people. We work to recognize that Native people, we're contemporary people. We're still here, our values intact, we work hard, and we are generous and highly social. I'm wondering if Brittany can speak to the 7 generations concept.
Absolutely. In addition to being here, and in addition to us being highly social and in every walk of life, you've probably worked with a Native person, whether you knew that or you didn't. That the thought process is not just, and the worldview is not just centered on what we can do now. It is thinking about having yourself in the center. When I talk about balance as a core value of Indigenous peoples, it's, if you're thinking of yourself at center, at the balance point, you're also thinking that 7 generations ahead, you're also pulling from 7 generations behind you. So if there's any nerds out there, if you've ever seen Avatar, like Aang talks to all the previous avatars, it's not quite that deep, but it is that deep understanding that we bring with us, all of that history, all of that knowledge, and science is just starting to catch up, understanding that even in our DNA, we're carrying that historic trauma. We're also carrying that historic wisdom, whether folks are tapped into it or not, or tapped in different ways, depending on the levels of trauma, because again, we've had very diverse and different experiences. But we're also thinking about what's coming and what's next. We're only here for a short amount of time. And in that way, making sure that we're practicing inclusion, that we're practicing ways to steward the land, steward our relationships very deeply. So that's first and foremost at the forefront. The other piece that I would like to point out, particularly when it comes to giving, because our communities have been so exploited, and because there has always been some version of a snake oil salesman, for lack of a better way of saying it, that enter our communities, say these things are going to happen and then they never do, or come into our communities, say we're going to do this research and then pull back out. Our communities, rightfully so, are very wary, and it does take a long time to build that trusted relationship. And I will pass it back to Donna as she really talks about how deep and important those relationships are, and sometimes how hard it can be to build them.
Yeah, absolutely. We at Native Americans in Philanthropy have been working on this project of philanthropy fundraisers, engaging in all of our most vulnerable issues. The relationship that you have is the key. One of our primary issues that we often talk about as kind of a whole is our visibility. This was really true in the 2020 election when CNN put up a reader board that said different communities in how they voted in the election, and the marker that they used for Native Americans was, quote, something else. We're not showing up in data, and this is not from our own perspective, but this is what kind of the environment has done. We're not showing up in data collection. This has impacted, the visibility issue has impacted our most vulnerable populations, from women and girls, and impacted the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's also impacting in philanthropy in how we're giving and showing how we're receiving funds, and also tracking if Native people are giving to your cause. Right now, the US uses Form 990s to track the giving and receiving of funds, the in and the out. And our visibility issue is making it so that we don't show up on anybody's radar when we know, in fact, that we are the first philanthropists. So coming back around to that relationship, if you are in relationship with your Indigenous community, then you know and you can track and you can be responsive to the whole sector, to that invisibility issue. So that one noticing and that one relationship that you have is an entry point to solve some of the biggest issues that Native people as a whole battle. So, yeah.
And just to, I'm sorry, and just to further contextualize it, President Nixon, while we may have mixed feelings, he was one of the best presidents when it came to looking at Native policy. And it was because he had a Native American coach. Just that one relationship of and he knew, and he actually said that had this man been had been white, he would have been able to coach at the college level, but he was only coaching at the high school level. So seeing and having that relationship and understanding how deep that can go can forever change how policy is written. It can change how we enter into agreements with one another. It can change how we're viewing one another, and it can also change some of those key statistics that we pointed out to earlier.
Thank you both. Talbert, would you be willing to speak a little bit about what ways philanthropy could be successful in bridging governmentalities between tribal nations and the US government, or even specifically with the Miccosukee community as well?
Sure. I think they've mentioned a lot of what it can do, because philanthropy builds trust. And at the heart of tribal nations, we all share a common tight-knit theme when it comes to a community. So, all tribal nations pretty much aren't going anywhere. Their reservations are where they are, and that's where they're going to be forever. And all tribal nations are always striving to have a place in local and state and federal government activities. So, it's about building trust.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Could you also speak to the history of marginalization experienced by Native people in the US? And this is open to all, but Talbert, if you could start.
Okay. Well, I think my people's history is a perfect example of the most harmful type of marginalization in the US. It's a refusal to acknowledge sovereignty and each tribe's unique relationship with the United States. Tribal nations, they share similar traumas and hardships when it comes to genocide and removal, but our histories aren't all the same. And I think American people oftentimes don't want to hear that side of the story. They would rather see the pageantry and the exotic parts of our culture and ignore the government to government relations that tribes are owed. We're all Native, but we're all also very different.
I'll add on there to say that sometimes Native people are kind of categorized in a race or an ethnicity, but this is not true. We are not just one thing alone. We're also have unique political classifications. We have citizenship here, and that treaties are the supreme law of the land here. And the treaties give settlers the right to be here, not us. This is our land. These are our nations. We don't even need recognition from an outside government to be who we are. And so this kind of concept and idea of race was put upon us. These borders were put upon us, not the other way around. So we're good with who we are as people. Our communities are intact. I think we have said that, all three of us have said that in the beginning part of this presentation here, and we're really proud of who we are as people. I think today in particular, as we are looking at what happened with the murder of George Floyd, with the climate crisis, with all of our very serious global and even local issues, the pandemic even, we're looking to Indigenous people. We're looking to the people who have the knowledge of this land who have the knowledge of relationship and have a connection to generosity and healing and understanding. Working together in community is a lesson that the world can take from us, and as very generous people, we're willing to share.
And I would just add on to that, that part of that transactional relationship is sometimes seen as we need saviors. We don't need saviors. We're not in a position of saving. We are actually in a position of giving and sharing, and that in that reciprocal relationship, we do need a different worldview. We can see our climate is shifting and changing due to us not being in balance and us not paying attention to our mother, the earth. We can also see in our school to prison pipelines and all the ways in which our society is failing, for that there has to be another way of looking at how we get along with one another, because even if you can shoot a rocket into space, we still only have one earth, and we're all going to be here, and we all have to at least find a way to be able to work together and get along. And I think that's indigenous wisdom that we have to offer, that I think the world should very much continue to listen to. As tribal nations, just to pin that one more time, we are nations, we are governments, we aren't, we have that rights, autonomy that are inherent with or without the US federal government saying, or without any other government telling us who we are and what we are. We are definitely our own nations and our own governance, and we have that right, and we often exercise it, which is why we often end up in the federal Supreme Court more than any other group of people. So with that knowledge, we do want to make sure that that you understand that we have a lot to offer and that we want to share what we have to offer.
So I love what you all said, where we don't need to be saved, right? And I think so often folks get into that frame of mind. And you all, Native Americans, Indigenous folks, were really the first philanthropists, right? I mean, there's no arguing about that. And what I'm most appreciative about is this honest conversation, because I know that I'm getting text messages from individuals who are saying, I knew none of this. This is so important for us to know. And so this is obviously going to be one of many conversations. But one thing, Dawn and Brittany, that you know that I was super excited about was all the knowledge that you dropped when I told you about our development officers and how we should approach leadership. And I saw some slides, so I would love for you to talk a little bit about that and to give us those nuggets as it pertains to what we should be aware of as we do our work in philanthropy.
Yeah, absolutely. I really want development officers to enter into a good relationship in a good way. I, being a development officer myself, as the Vice President of Development for Native Americans in Philanthropy, I want you to know that we're acting with respect beyond an acknowledgement of a community or their issues. We're seeking to receive funding from Native groups or tribes or even Native individuals. We need to sustain relationships with stakeholders that are based on mutual learning, understanding, a desire to identify solutions that benefit the whole community. You should definitely ask about protocols, cultural gifts, and exchange for time and information provided. So you really need to strive to be patient. It's the reciprocity that we often speak about here. Second, you should know the Native communities you are engaging with. We always say that we must first have a personal connection before we can engage in the bigger picture. So you need to show your interest in the community. And so it does mean doing your research. Third, be committed to sustaining the relationship and grow your progress. From grant-making organizations, this can mean like multi-year funding or opportunities to, ask for the multi-year funding, ask for opportunities to invest in capacity building and growth. It also can mean site visits, offering opportunities from Native communities for speaking or learning, and also making the introductions to the networks. So for example, there's sometimes intentional silence during the days of following a meeting, and this is seen as proper protocol. You're using this time to figure out your thoughts and you're focusing on your response. The Western view of like immediate response is something that you will see a difference in. And then finally, you need to engage in some consensus-based decision-making. The active consensus is it's not linear. It's not like a single step process. It's where you place the good of the whole group above your own individual preferences. You allow not just for diversity, but you are practicing inclusion. That means that you are open to dissent, you are open to disagreement, you're open to listening. As my grandfather used to say, 2 ears, 1 mouth. We listen twice as much as we speak. And this is vital to have the consensus from Indigenous communities that you engage in. Also, it's really important that you are transparent about your organization, where your money is held, and how it will be used. For a lot of different Indigenous communities, it's really vital that you are not holding your funds in extractive industry. They don't want to invest in something that they then have to solve later. So you're aligning your values with the community that you are engaging in. And then you're also really flexible with how people are involved in your donor relationship. You need to make the assumption that people want to give. And we're always talked about in this kind of deficit mindset, and we need to stop doing that with Native people. We are not charity cases. We have what doesn't matter how much funding we have, we want to have the opportunity to give just like everyone else, and even more so because it is part of our culture to give.
And I just want to add on that as a very real experience you may have. You may be yelled at. You may be in a situation where you're humbled, and that's okay. Sometimes discomfort is part of the growth process. And even if you are, if you've had a relationship with someone, whether it's a partner, whether it's your parents, whether it's your siblings or your children, it's not always happy-go-lucky. We're all in this, even though we're all in this together, there will be times of discomfort. So I want to make sure that I preface and say that in a very real way. There may be times where building that relationship is uncomfortable because it's moving from transactional to something that's actually real. There may be need for reconciliation. We know that much of philanthropy has been built off the backs of brown, Black, and Indigenous peoples. And sometimes just taking the opportunity to take a step back and really examine where this wealth has come from, and also how we can move ourselves into a better place of balance, and understanding how it should be redistributed and how it should be part of it. And it's okay to tell the hard truths and the ugly truths. And it's okay because that is our history, whether it's, again, not all sunshines and rainbows, and it's not all propaganda about how great America is. Yes, America's great. And yes, America has a lot of things that we need to talk about and resolve. And I really, again, pinpoint that Native people are in every sector. We're in every socioeconomic space and place. There are Native millionaires and there are Native folks who are not millionaires. So we are there in every single place and space. And there are lots of opportunities to engage and to build that relationship.
I really liked what you said about how, you know, it's not transactional, right? It has to be about relationship. I know one of the things that we've been discussing as a group is our messaging, right? And FIU as a whole. What can we do better, I think, when you're talking to institutions when it comes to messaging and letting you know, our neighbors know that, you know, we want them to come to FIU. We want them to be a part of what we're doing. You know, we want to engage with them. Do you have any words of wisdom when it comes to that space?
I think I'll start with that, particularly when you're working with people of culture, communities of color, it's not just a one and done. It has to be a continual conversation. You have to continue to send that message out. So it can't be just we put a post on social media so everyone knows. Everyone may see it, but they don't necessarily know it's for them. Or, well, it's on our website. It's not an appropriate answer to, will we put the information out? And I can also harp on the federal government who does that a lot. There does have to be more in person. There is actually going to the community. There is asking the community how they want to receive information or how they want to know what's happening, or if that is something that they see as beneficial, or and having the conversations around that. And I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Dom.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that with everything that Brittany said, it is asking those key questions and really reflecting on who we are and how we relate to one another. Making the assumption that we have more in common with each other than we have in difference with each other. We also talk a lot at Native Americans in Philanthropy about really asking the leadership of your organization when you're about ready to engage with Native donors or tribal organizations. Who do you have on your board? What does your own board look like at your university? What does your leadership look like? It doesn't have to have 100% Native representation, but are you doing the work to reach out to communities of culture and communities of color? A lot of different studies point to the fact that it takes about 7 to 10 more times to do outreach and engagement with communities of culture or communities of color when recruiting senior level staff members or board members, because we live in a society that just reflects a one culture alone. And so we also want to know how we're being supported. We want to know that you are one of those communities that is open. And then we also want facts. We want to know how contributions make an impact, not only on your organization, but on the values that we care about as well, where we find some congruency.
And I just want to touch on something you mentioned a minute ago with folks texting going, I didn't know any of this. It's intentional. It was intentional. It's on purpose. Erasure of Indigenous peoples has been part of the system for a very long time. So even if you're right next door to a Native community, you may not know anything about that Native community, and it was on purpose. So there's no need to beat yourself up over, I just didn't know. It is a place of ignorance, and there there are lots of opportunities to move from now I know to that next step.
That's very good, Brittany. Thank you. I so appreciated your words of wisdom from both you and Dawn. For you, Talbert, I know that you are definitely a friend of FIU, and you've been very, very engaged with us over the years, but I feel like that we could be doing better. And so what words of wisdom can you share with us? And we do have leadership that's watching. How can we do better in engaging with our own neighbors?
Well, I'm a councilman for now, right? Maybe not next week or whatever, but engaging with me is one thing. And if you understand our tribal government, I'm only a part of the community. I might be leadership in the government sense, but I'm not a leader when it comes to somebody else's family or something like that. There are, grandmas, uncles that, will have more say over somebody that's some of the younger members of our community. So it's a lot about engaging leadership, but also the whole community, right? Because eventually our tribe runs as almost like a true democracy where everybody over 18 basically votes for policy. The leadership presents it and gives their opinion on it, but the community is the one that's going to vote on it and see it through. So I would say, it's a task for me as well, and for the tribe, because we're not used to reaching out, so we're all learning at the same time. We mostly have liked to be left alone, but now, it's not an option anymore. We have to evolve, and we can still be ourselves while we do that. So, I'm learning from you guys, and hopefully you're learning from me, and we can continue going forward with a relationship.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much. So I know one of the questions to Talbert that we had for you is, in what ways could philanthropy be successful in bridging governmentalities between tribal nations and the US government? We do have our DC office very engaged in government relations. So how do you see philanthropy playing a role in that space?
Well, as the ladies pointed out, that we're not looking to be saved, right? But we're looking for information, supplies, whatever it may be to help our community. For instance, during the pandemic, we were provided with a lot of vaccinations to the tribe, and the tribe took that and distributed it out to the community, our employees, and we ended up with over 80% vaccination throughout our whole community, as well as with our employees. So that has helped save a lot of lives within our community. It's helped to look out for each other and stuff like that. So, we just want to have a relationship with everybody, and we can all learn from each other.
I'm going to have Mandy close out, but before we do, I can say that honestly, I think some of the greatest takeaways, when you start doing this work, I think you forget that the relationship is really important, that, it's just more than the one person that you're talking to, but it's really about the community, right? And them making decisions collectively. And I also think too, that as we engage in this work of diversity, that we have to remember that specific populations don't need to be saved, right? We've been doing this for a very, very long time. But I think that it's important that we start to shift our mind and how we're doing things in philanthropy. And also, making sure that we are respectful and be willing to learn. And I think that's probably the scariest part, right? Because we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to say, anything that's going to offend anyone. But I think that as we continue to have those honest conversations as we do this work, I think that that honesty will be most appreciated. And I know that that's really what I got out of this conversation today. And we want to dig a little bit deeper. So there'll definitely be a part 2. We'll be inviting you all back. But thank you all so much. And we really appreciate the time that you all took today. Mandy, did you want to say something before we close?
I'd like to also thank everybody for being a part of this panel. I really appreciate your voices in terms of allowing us to learn more about this. I think the learning part is the big thing of, educating ourselves and truly, not being ignorant and actually asking the questions and reading and learning about the culture and history of what the reality of what that looks like, and having these open, honest conversations and the importance of that. So I just want to thank you all. Very amazing to hear about the history, Talbert, and learn more about your community and culture. And thanks again, Dawn and Brittany. I really appreciate you speaking to us. And I know we want to also open up to questions as well.
So our VP, George Corton, said, truly amazing conversation. Thank you to the panelists for this important discussion. So thank you all. I don't think there's any questions. I don't see any in the Q&A. They'll probably come later and I'll send them to you. But thank you all again. And there'll be a part 2. We'll be in touch. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.